Lady Gaga said, "I'm just trying to change the world one sequin at a time." I think that's rather lovely. I've got to say, one recent fashion fad that I'm fully behind is the reversible sequin on a lot of kids' tops. There's something uniquely satisfying about doing that. It's just great, isn't it? Yeah. No, it's really good. We'll get you one. And sequins are rather beautiful. But a sad truth about sequins is they're not great for the environment. Oxfam in 2019 said that at the end of the Christmas period, about 1.9 million sequined items would end up in landfill at the end of the seasonal period, with those items only worn about 5 times. So I was rather pleased to learn that Yorkshire was doing its part in trying to deal with this problem. The University of Leeds is working with the fashion designer Paula Core and the Sustainable Sequin Company to actually overcome the problem. They're developing what they hope will be a natural polymer film, which will lead to the first biodegradable sequin. I know we don't really think of ourselves living in a place of textile innovation, but Yorkshire still holds its own on that front. I think that's great. I think it's interesting thinking about clothes as something that's potentially innovative. I've got to say, I find clothes a uniquely fascinating topic. Not only are clothes beautiful, potentially, but they raise all sorts of interesting ethical questions. Like, what's the impact that our clothes have on the environment? Apparently, we should limit ourselves to about 9 new garments a year to minimise or make it sustainable for, our carbon footprints. I certainly don't keep to that, I'm afraid. I don't know how many of us do. And how are our clothes produced? Who makes them? Are they made ethically or in sweatshops? But what do clothes say about our spiritual life? I think fashion and faith seem like a rather incongruous pair. I think many would leap to conclusions about what Christianity says about what seems like a potentially rather frivolous topic, like fashion. And I've got to say, when I came to faith about 4 years ago, it became a real tension in my mind. I would be sort of lying awake, poring over the Gospels, thinking, right, well, I'm a Christian now. Am I still allowed to buy those new shoes that I really want? I know, you all had me down as someone sort of a deep spiritual thinker, but that was really the questions that were on my mind. But the Bible actually says some fascinating things about clothing. In May 2000, the Bible Society actually took out a 6-page spread in the fashion magazine British Vogue. And this came as a bit of a surprise to a lot of people. And Tom Wright, who was the Bishop of Durham at the time, was asked about it. And he said the idea behind the spread was that clothes are a sign of hope, that we know deep down that we are to be more fully clothed, more fully and truly ourselves in God's ultimate future. I find that an intriguing idea. Clothes as a sign of hope. Our first reading today is probably one of the most famous involving an item of clothing. Joseph and his Technicolor Dreamcoat. Though, as Sue's pointed out, that's probably not really what the Hebrew actually says. It might actually mean the coat with the long sleeves. But I don't think that's going to have Andrew Lloyd Webber racing back to his desk to rewrite it. And it's fascinating, when you actually think about it, a lot of Joseph's story is told through the clothing. His father tries to express his love for Joseph by giving him the coat. It's a sign of love for him. But also, it becomes a sign of favoritism, which really hacks off the brothers, unsurprisingly. And Joseph himself is rather arrogant as a result of his new beautiful clothes. Joseph's brothers and his father express themselves through their clothes. When they're upset, they tear their garments. And clothes are used to deceive in this story as well. Joseph's brothers sell Joseph to passing traders, and they take the coat and dip it in blood to try and deceive their father that in fact he's been killed. Clothes can be deceptive. Maybe we sometimes use clothes to cover up our own wounded desires. And the sort of petty jealousies that we see around the coat show what happened when we devalue human life. Joseph's brothers devalue him to such an extent that they feel happy to sell him into slavery. You know, a lot of fast fashion that we see now devalues human life. Earlier this year, Zara was just one of the retailers that was sued in Paris for its association with practices that probably involved forced labour and human trafficking in China. You know, buying cheap clothes probably means that you're wearing something that has been made by children in Pakistan, India, or Joseph's ultimate destination, Egypt. And it's not really easy in the midst of a cost of living crisis telling people that they need to spend more on their clothes. But it's an issue. So if this all sounds rather a bit bleak, where's the hope in the clothes in this story? Joseph's coat points towards a more hopeful future for him. When Joseph actually arrives in Egypt, he ends up in the house of Potiphar. And Potiphar's wife tries to seduce him. And when he resists her advances, he's stripped again of his clothes, where he ends up in jail before coming to the attention of Pharaoh due to his ability to discern dreams. And Pharaoh finally dresses Joseph in clothes that fit him. Pharaoh takes him and puts his own signet ring on Joseph's hand. He dresses him in fine linen and puts a chain around his neck. Joseph's dreams, Joseph's coat, has always pointed to that ultimate reality. For all the moral ambiguity around the clothes in the story, Joseph's coat is a sign of hope in how his story will turn out. I wonder if we see clothes as a sign of hope. Do any of us have a favourite item of clothing? I know I have a favourite item of clothing. It's these cufflinks. They were my granddad's. My nana gave them to me on the day of his funeral. And they're pretty big. They're pretty gold. They're pretty 70s. They're very grandad. You know, but they provide me with a very tangible link to the happy childhood that I spent with him, knocking around in County Durham. I spent a lot of my childhood with my granddad. He was a lovely guy. He was usually quite well turned out as well. But maybe these cufflinks point to a potentially restored, renewed, resurrected future that give me a sense of hope. So where do you see hope in clothing? Do you have a favourite item of clothing? It might be your wedding dress that promises so much as to the life you hope and crave for, and I very much hope that you actually received. Maybe it might be a football strip. Yeah? Reminding you of all the fun you have playing with friends and loved ones, and the hope of that career in the Premier League, tantalisingly close. So I'd like you to turn to the person next to you, and I'd like you to talk about your favourite item of clothing. What hope does it offer you? What comfort does it bring you? What joy does it bring you? Think about it. I bet some of you, your minds will have gone quite blank at this point. But yeah, talk amongst yourselves, spend a few minutes, delight in the joy of fashion. That looks like it's been a more enthusiastic discussion than I was anticipating. I thought I might be on my own with my cufflinks. Has anyone got anything intriguing they want to share?
All that talk and nobody wants to share.
Oh, all that chat, what were they talking about? Oh, David's got something, hang on. We'll do the mic.
I've got something to say as a dedicated follower of fashion. Amy here, a friend, has a piece of clothing, and on it just says chosen. And she says that's really meaningful for her because it reminds her that she's chosen by God and valuable to God.
Oh, Alan, there we go.
My walking boots.
Oh, very practical. Good idea. Oh, Kim. There you go.
So when I was chatting to Terry, he said his favourite item of clothing are his joggers because unlike things with zippers and buttons, it means he's independent. So the hope for him is his independence.
Yeah, very good. Oh, David.
Yeah, this goes back to my days as a child at school. My best friend one day came to school and whenever I saw him, he had a tie on. And from that day on, I started wearing a tie. But he did show me how to tie a Windsor knot. So every time I wear a tie, which I've got a string of ties now for whether it's seasonable, whether it goes with the shirt, or whether it's anything to do with whatever. A tie is quite appropriate. I love ties.
Double Windsor as well. Can't believe John doesn't have anything to say on this. You got anything? Oh, your favourite cardigan. We'll keep that thought. Now, the English mystic Julian of Norwich had this to say. Our Lord showed me spiritually in a vision how intimately he loves me. I saw that he is to us everything that is good and comforting to our help. He is our clothing, that out of love entraps us and enfolds us, embraces us and wholly encloses us, surrounding us for tender love, so that he can never leave us. It's interesting, Julian of Norwich, she was a 14th century English mystic, and if you're looking to spice up your prayer life, I really recommend her book, Revelations of Divine Love. It's probably the first example we have of a book written by a woman in English. And it is great. And for Julian, a person remains fundamentally good. And our bodily nature, the stuff of our lives, the mundane stuff, the clothes, things like that, is something beautiful, not to be regretted. She's saying that God is so close to each of us. He's like the shirt on our backs. And we see that in Joseph's story. God draws so closely to Joseph and accompanies him through that tale, and he's seen moving in the various items of clothing that he's put on his back and stripped of before he ultimately finds how he's supposed to be dressed. I think Julian of Norwich is referred to as a mystic. We don't really talk much about mystics, and maybe it's the sort of word that maybe leaves us feeling a little bit uncomfortable. Maybe it sounds odd or eccentric. But a mystic isn't someone who's just given to sort of fantastical visions of impossible things. A mystic is someone who sees God's promise, God's hope in the mundane items of their lives, where they see it in things like bread and wine, and yes, in clothing. You know, maybe I think we need to rediscover our inner mystic, searching out for the beauty in our lives, the things that surround us, God's hope and promise to each of us. Because Jesus certainly doesn't say that we shouldn't have clothes. He says God knows we need these things. He tells us not to be anxious about them. And I think Jesus' point at the end of the day is that no matter how beautiful, no matter how perfect an item of clothing might seem, all it is a tantalizing sign of hope, hinting at the beauty and transcendence of each living soul. Clothes can only hint at that. They can't be a substitute for it. For Jesus, it's really about getting our desires in the right order. First seek God's kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things will be given to you. God's kingdom is there to be found for the mystics. And it's strange, really. Clothing, in a really mundane way, has kind of become like a little microcosm of my faith. It reminds me and calls me forward to actually try and find the beauty and God's hope in those things that surround me. And it also challenges me, like faith should. It makes me think about how I live my life. It makes me recognize how connected I am to those who make my clothes, the network that delivers my clothes to me. It makes me recognize the impact maybe on the environment my clothes might have. And it almost makes me think about who's making my clothes. It raises all these interesting ethical dilemmas, which I think is an important part of a journey of faith. And it's once we're wrestling with these things, searching for beauty and challenging ourselves and asking questions, that, like Lady Gaga said, we can start changing the world one sequin at a time.